my sibling, the golden child, sabotaged my business startup, prompting me to sever ties with my toxic family. Years later, they returned, hoping to invest, but I simply laughed in their faces. I'm a 33-year-old woman who hasn't spoken to my parents in 3 years. It all started when my younger brother, 30, convinced them to pull out of investing in my business at the last minute, leaving me high and dry after I'd already left my job. Let's be real, I despise my brother, and it's not just because of what happened with the business. I've always resented him ever since I realized my parents favored him over me. He was the golden child, and I was, well, whatever. Our immigrant parents hail from a culture where men are treated like royalty, so equality between us was never on the cards. They never pretended otherwise. From the get-go, I knew my brother would always come first. Our parents are deeply traditional, subscribing to the belief that a woman's sole responsibilities revolve around home, marriage, and children. I understood early on that they had hoped for a son first, and I was not what they had in mind. They weren't outright cruel to me, but the favoritism towards my brother was painfully evident. Things might have been different if my brother hadn't been such a huge jerk, but alas, he was. He always knew that our parents would favor him no matter what, and he shamelessly exploited that to his advantage. He made sure to steal the spotlight whenever I succeeded and ensured that every moment revolved around him. For instance, on my 18th birthday, he announced he was dating a college senior and planned to drop out of high school to live with her. This bombshell sent our parents into a frenzy, along with the guests at my party who heard his wild declaration. None of it was true, but by then my birthday was ruined. This was just a glimpse of his attention-seeking antics. He was a horrible human being, and I despise him to this day. Once I moved away for college, I never looked back, only going home when absolutely necessary. My parents didn't seem to miss me much. They had their golden child, and that was all that mattered. Even when he left for college, his departure was marked with a grand farewell, while my own goodbye was a small affair with just family and a few friends. They threw him a massive party, inviting everyone they knew and even renting out a restaurant to celebrate. I never had any illusions about my parents. Once I reached adulthood, I was on my own. They had no interest in spending money on me, and the only reason they paid for my college was because my dad was wealthy. I was actually relieved they were well off. To them, funding my education was a waste since I was only supposed to marry and start a family after graduation. I begged them to let me go, promising eternal gratitude, and I suspect that the desire to maintain some control over me was what made them agree to pay for my college education. That's my guess, but it seems pretty likely. After graduating from business school with flying colors, finding a job was a breeze. When I started earning, I told my parents I would repay them eventually, though it wouldn't be anytime soon. They were a bit disappointed because they had expected me to start looking for a husband right after graduation so I could settle down and start a family. My mother was particularly opposed to the idea of me working, insisting it was safer for me to focus on finding a husband, fearing that as I got older and wealthier, no man would want to marry me. It sounds like a nightmare, and it pretty much was, but that's just how my parents are. I can only guess they were raised to think this way, though unlearning such biases is always possible. They never bothered to try, but I explained to my mother that times were changing and that independence was more important to me than starting a family. They were mad at me for a few weeks, but when they saw that it didn't bother me, things returned to normal, and we resumed a civil relationship. By then, I had already started repaying my debt, thanks to my stable job and decent income. After a few years of frugal living, I managed to clear the entire amount. Once that was done, I saw little reason to maintain a cordial relationship with my parents. It was abundantly clear that my brother was their only priority. We used to meet occasionally for lunches or family gatherings, but after settling my debt, I began to see them less. Being around them had become suffocating as they constantly pressured me to find a husband and marry as soon as possible. I started reducing my visits to their house. Another reason was their incessant bragging about my brother. He had graduated from business school, but he had been a terrible student, spending his years partying instead of studying. I couldn't understand what they were so proud of. It was frustrating because they never bragged about my accomplishments, even though I was in a much better position than him and earning significantly more. My brother couldn't even secure a job on his own, so my dad hired him out of obligation. He could barely perform any work, yet he still got paid, which hardly seemed impressive or brag-worthy. But I was used to being treated this way by my parents, so it didn't come as a surprise. The only reason I had stayed in touch with them was out of a sense of obligation because I owed them money, and it felt odd to be estranged. Once that debt was settled, I focused more on my own work, and they didn't push to see me more often, so we naturally drifted apart. A couple of years later, a coworker and I decided to brainstorm and start our own business. After extensive planning, we had everything mapped out before I even considered approaching my parents. We had a solid business plan because I wanted to present myself not just as their daughter, but as a serious businesswoman seeking an investment. At that time, my parents and I were barely on speaking terms. It was awkward for me to ask my parents for money, but I knew my dad was a brilliant businessman, and his expertise would be invaluable. My partner agreed that this was our best option, so I approached my parents for an investment. To my surprise, they were quite impressed with the business plan my partner and I had developed. They didn't find it strange that I was seeking their help after years of distance, and they understood this was a purely business transaction. I don't think they would have invested if the idea hadn't been solid. It was clear that they didn't care much about me as their daughter, but my dad liked the prospect of making more money, which is why he agreed. However, it was just a verbal agreement, and he said he'd only finalize the legal paperwork after his lawyers did their due diligence and we had something more concrete than just plans. For months, my partner and I continued to work our day jobs while also developing our business. We had a few potential investors, but my parents were willing to make the largest investment and contribute the most. To keep them on board and impress them, we had to work incredibly hard. After months of hard work, with about 75% of the project completed, I approached my father again. He expressed his admiration for our progress and agreed to finalize the paperwork. My partner and I promptly handed in our 2 weeks' notice the next day, expecting the investment to come through soon. However, just a few days later, my parents called me back to their house to say they had reconsidered and would no longer invest in my business. I remember that conversation vividly. It felt like the world had ended. I couldn't believe they were abandoning me just like that. When I asked why they had changed their minds, given that they had been supportive just a week earlier, I sensed something was off. I knew I had to find out what was really going on. I pressed them until they finally revealed that they had consulted with my brother, who had convinced them that my business was not worth investing in and would fail. My father was backing out solely on his word. I was stunned and asked why my brother hadn't voiced these concerns earlier. My dad explained that my brother had been mulling it over for some time but wanted to see what I would come up with before making a decision. It hit me instantly. My brother hadn't been genuinely considering the business's viability. He had only been plotting how devastating it would be for me if he sabotaged me at the last minute. That's exactly what he had done. Like a devious snake, he had waited until I had completed most of the work to tell my dad he thought it was a bad idea, ensuring my dad backed out and I was left in a precarious situation. He had played his cards perfectly to leave me in a bind. I lost it that day at my parents' house and told them to go jump off a cliff. I said a lot of harsh things about my parents and my brother before going back home to regroup and figure out my next steps. My partner was counting on me and I couldn't let him down. I shared what had happened with him, and he comforted me, suggesting we could retract our resignations if the company would still have us. But I had already taken a leap and wasn't willing to go back, so I started seeking other investors. We needed the funding badly because our savings weren't enough for our ambitious ideas. We pitched our business idea to anyone who would listen, determined to sell it hard. After a couple of weeks, we secured a few investors who provided the critical funding we needed, and we began building our business from the ground up. The first few months were incredibly tough. There was an overwhelming amount of work, and we had many sleepless nights, constantly questioning if we were making the right choices and if our venture would succeed. A few months later, we managed to break even, and our business has been thriving ever since. We haven't looked back, and it's all thanks to the hard work my partner and I poured into it. We had unwavering faith in our idea and ourselves, knowing we could make it work. Despite my brother's cunning scheme, he couldn't derail my path to success because it was clearly meant to be. The only silver lining was that I no longer had to pretend to be on good terms with my family or tolerate their nonsense. I had seen their true colors, but I had been willing to give them a chance, thinking they would be my safest bet. I had forgotten just how deceitful they were and how manipulative my brother could be. They didn't deserve to be part of this journey, and I'm glad they didn't invest because I wouldn't want them to be part of my success story. They never even apologized for letting me down at the last minute, and we haven't spoken since I stormed out of their house that day. I was secretly relieved they hadn't reached out after that, as I wasn't sure what I'd say to them. However, recently, they did get back in touch because they wanted to invest in my business. Of course, now that we're successful, everyone wants to be involved. This happened just a few days ago, on a Sunday. I was at home, and they showed up at my apartment. I've lived in the same place since college, so it was easy for them to find me. When I saw them standing outside my door, I was taken aback. I couldn't imagine they'd have anything to say to me after all this time, almost 3 years since the incident, and they had never tried to reach out before. Despite my shock, I opened the door and let them in, thinking they might apologize and try to make amends. Some part of me hoped they were there to make things right with me, but I was wrong. They were only there to say they now realized I was doing well and wanted to invest in my business, seeing it as an opportunity to get involved. They didn't bother with small talk or asking about what I was up to, they got straight to the point. I appreciated their directness since it saved me time and spared me any false hopes of reconciliation. It was comical how optimistic they seemed, as if they genuinely expected me to welcome them aboard without question. I just laughed in their faces and told them that wasn't going to happen, so they could leave because there was nothing more to discuss. My father looked utterly shocked, struggling to find words. His face turned red as he said I had no right to insult him, insisting that I had to treat him with respect since he was my father, despite their lifelong treatment of me. I told him I was showing them the exact amount of respect they had shown me over the years, especially since he was there as an investor and a businessman, not as my father. My parents looked scandalized, and I could see they wanted to argue, but I wasn't in the mood to entertain it. I told them to leave and made it clear I didn't want any investment from them. We were done. My mother started crying, saying she had always known that letting me go to college would backfire someday, but she hadn't expected it to happen so soon. I had no idea what she was talking about, but I just wanted them to leave, so I told them to go once more. They refused to move, and my mother continued to cry on my couch, whining about how I had embarrassed them. She told my father that if he hadn't paid for my college, I wouldn't have gotten a big head and would have done whatever they asked. She believed that letting me go to college had been a mistake, and allowing me to work was an even bigger mistake because it had made me arrogant and proud. She insisted that if I hadn't pursued those opportunities and had just focused on finding a husband, I would have had a family by now. Instead, I was still single in my 30s and would probably never have a husband or kids. She blamed my father for all of this, saying he never should have entertained the idea of investing in my business just to get me to listen to them. At that moment, I realized they were back only because they wanted to enforce their control over me once again. They didn't care about me or my business. Their main concern was appearances. It was clear that my unmarried status and lack of children were damaging to their reputation. They argued in the living room as if I wasn't even there, and after a while, I had had enough. I told them to get up and leave or I would call the cops. My mother started crying even more hysterically, screaming about how wrong it was for me to threaten my own parents with the police. I was getting really impatient and couldn't handle it anymore, so I stood up and physically removed them from my apartment. I work out and am quite tall, and it helped that they didn't see it coming. They were caught completely off guard, making it easy for me to push them out and slam the door shut. They left, and I thought it was over, but a couple of hours later, I got a call from my brother, who was furious. He threatened to sue, claiming I had physically harmed our parents and demanding an apology because I was supposed to respect the people who had raised me and made me capable of reaching this position. I found it ridiculous. I had been quite gentle with them, and I didn't think they were hurt. I don't think it's illegal to push people out of your own apartment, but my family is up in arms against me right now. They're threatening to sue if I don't apologize, and I can't understand what they're so upset about. It's exhausting dealing with all this hostility, and I'm at a loss for what to do next. I resorted to physically pushing my parents out of my house. Update 1 ***. Hey everyone, it's been a week since my parents showed up, and I ended up kicking them out of my house, and now my brother is playing the moral police. My relatives have launched a full-blown hate campaign against me online, and it's been a tough week. At first, I considered apologizing just to stop the barrage of hate and get them to leave me alone. After talking to my partner and reading the comments here, I realized that this hostility was never going to end. Even if I apologized, they'd just find another reason to target me. There was also a valid point made that apologizing could be seen as an admission of guilt, making it easier for them to file a lawsuit. So apologizing is off the table for now. I think the best thing I can do is block them all and hope the situation dies down soon because I really can't handle the stress. I also want to address some questions from the comments about why I continued to keep in touch with them for so long despite their mistreatment throughout my childhood. Honestly, I don't have a clear answer. I guess I just wanted to have a family. As I mentioned in my original post, they weren't outright cruel to me all the time, which made it easier to hold on to the hope that things could get better. We did have a few good moments, and I think that's what kept me holding on. Just to clarify, I'm talking about my parents here. My brother and I never had a relationship, and I'm actually relieved to be rid of him. He's literally the devil in human form, and I'm sure you've figured that out by now. The way he sabotaged my business before it even started by convincing our parents to back out when all the work was already done was pure evil genius. I have to give him credit for his ruthlessness because I don't think anyone else could have concocted such a devastatingly cruel plan to ruin someone else's life just for the sake of it. Update 2 ***. I decided to talk to my partner about what to do next regarding my parents and the online backlash from my relatives. I was worried that the posts they were making might reach my business associates and harm our image. I feared it could negatively impact us, but my partner advised me to ignore it and act like it never happened. He suggested that eventually my relatives would stop hating me once they see it doesn't bother me. They have their own lives, and when they realize that their efforts to upset me are futile, they'll likely move on to other things. He has a point, so I'm going to take his advice. Many of you suggested that I make a post or respond to them, and I appreciate the support, but I don't think that's necessary right now. Engaging with them would just lead to more drama. I want to focus on my work and move on with my life without constant distractions. Even though their disapproval doesn't affect me much, it's still a distraction, and I don't need that right now. Since my brother reached out to me from a different number after I blocked him 3 years ago, I decided to catch up on what he's been doing since then. When I cut off my family, I made it clear to my friends that I didn't want updates about him, but now I find myself curious. The last I heard from my friends was right after the fallout with my parents, and back then, my brother was still working under my dad at his company. Recently, I asked a few friends if they knew what he'd been up to, and they informed me he's still in the same job after all these years, which seems rather stagnant. They also mentioned that my dad's company is on the verge of being acquired, which might explain why my brother approached me. He likely wanted to be involved in something meaningful and not feel entirely worthless. I also can't dismiss what my mother said about wanting to exert control over me, possibly by having a stake in my business or even a majority share. However, that's their business now, not mine. I was simply curious to know where my brother stood these days. Update 3. It's been nearly a month since I first posted here. I shared a couple of updates in the following days, but then got really busy and didn't have much to report. Once my relatives realized I wasn't going to engage with their hate campaign, they stopped, and my parents and brother haven't tried to contact me since. It was clear that I wasn't going to apologize. I didn't have anything to apologize for. I just did what any reasonable person would have done. So that's the situation with my family. By the way, my dad's company got acquired recently. I heard about it from a friend a few days ago. They made a big deal out of it, posted about it, and even threw a party to celebrate the acquisition. However, I don't think they considered the possibility that this might mean my brother could lose his job in the long run. I can't imagine my brother being competent at anything, and the only reason he even has his current job is because my dad was in charge. Once that changes, it's anyone's guess what will happen. It will be interesting to see what happens when, or if, he gets laid off. I can't say it's right to take joy in someone else's misfortune, but I would be lying if I said I wouldn't enjoy watching my brother fail. Until then, you can just watch me succeed. I hope they keep track of my progress because I'm only going to get bigger and richer, so they better watch out. On a lighter note, many of you asked if my partner and I had a thing. It's sweet that people are looking for love, but he and I are just good friends. However, I do have a boyfriend, and we've been together for a couple of years. I didn't mention it before because it didn't seem relevant, and I've been so caught up with the whole mess my parents caused that it just slipped my mind. But yes, we've been together for a while, and things are going great. My parents don't know about him obviously, but we're even thinking about getting married in a year or so. And guess who won't be invited to that wedding? Lol. My parents had the chance to be decent human beings, but as usual, they messed it up,